There is a piece of blue glass in northern France that is roughly 800 years old. It sits in a window in Chartres Cathedral, and every restorer who has ever stood in front of it, with every modern furnace and every mass spectrometer and every chemical archive available to 21st century glassmaking, has admitted the same uncomfortable thing. They cannot make it again. Not exactly. Not the way the medieval craftsmen did. That is one example. There are 6 more in this video, and each one is stranger than the last. These are not myths. These are not legends polished by time. These are physical objects, sitting in museums and cathedrals and laboratory archives right now, that medieval engineers and physicians and metallurgists produced, and that we, with all our modern advantages, still cannot fully reproduce. Some of the formulas died with their inventors. Some of them survive on parchment, but refuse to work the way the originals did. And in at least one case, a 1,000-year-old recipe has just outperformed a modern antibiotic in a laboratory at a major British university. If you find that ordinary documentaries tell this kind of story too flatly, subscribe. This channel goes where the textbooks stop. We are starting with the blue, number 1. The blue of Chartres. The first item is a color, specifically a deep, luminous, almost otherworldly blue that floods the interior of Chartres Cathedral whenever the sun comes through the western windows. The locals call it bleu de Chartres. The art historians call it impossible to perfectly replicate. Here is what we know. The oldest of the surviving Chartres windows date to roughly 1145, with most of the great ensemble made between 1205 and 1240. Tests on the original glass show a sodic flux colored with cobalt oxide. That much is reproducible. The chemistry is not the secret. The secret is everything else. The medieval glass at Chartres is uneven, riddled with bubbles, dust motes, fragments of leaves that fell into the molten batch 800 years ago. The panes are nearly an inch thick. The cobalt itself was sourced from far-off mines in Eastern Europe, mixed with manganese in proportions specific to the period, and worked by craftsmen using a technique of irregular hand-blowing that produced a surface like rolling hills under your fingertip. And here is the problem. The Canterbury Cathedral Conservation Department has stated on the record that they have been searching for a glassmaker who can blow glass unevenly enough to match the medieval panes, and they have not found one. Modern glassblowers are too good. Their work is too flat. The shimmer that the medieval craftsmen achieved through controlled imperfection cannot be reverse engineered because we no longer have the imperfections. The cobalt has been refined. The sand has been purified. The technique that made the blue glow died with the workshops that made it. Why does a 13th century blue refuse to be matched by every restoration glass we have made? The official answer is that it is a matter of source materials and trade routes that no longer exist. The honest answer is that we know the chemistry, we know the recipe, and we still cannot produce the same effect. The artifact is real, the method is gone. From a color we cannot reproduce, we cross to a metal we cannot reforge. Number 2, Damascus steel, or more precisely, the Wootz crucible steel of the medieval Islamic world. Forge a blade in Damascus or Toledo, or somewhere along the Indian trade corridor any time between roughly the 3rd and the 18th century, and you might end up with something extraordinary. The steel had a surface pattern, a watered look, sometimes called the ladder or the rose, that ran through the body of the blade as structure rather than decoration. The blades were famously hard, famously sharp, famously springy in a way that early European steel was not. The recipes for making them, Wootz ingots imported from South India, smelted with specific plant additives in sealed crucibles, were passed master to apprentice for over 1,000 years. And then, around the early 19th century, the chain broke. The traditional formula was lost, not stolen, not suppressed, lost. The masters who knew it died without passing it on, or the trade in raw Wootz collapsed, or both. By the time European metallurgists with microscopes started looking at surviving Damascus blades, they could see what they were looking at, and they still could not reproduce it. Modern materials, science has come closer. Researchers in the early 2000s identified carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires inside surviving Wootz blades. Structures we now associate with cutting-edge nanotechnology formed accidentally by medieval smiths working with crucible temperatures, specific impurities, and a forging cycle whose timing was guarded as a craft secret. The blades, in other words, contain nanostructures centuries ahead of the science that would eventually name them. Picture that. A smith in 12th century Damascus, working a glowing crucible with no more than the inherited memory of his master's master, producing a blade with internal architecture that 20th century physicists would need an electron microscope to even see. We can describe what they made. We still argue about exactly how they made it. If the blue defied us with light, the steel defies us with structure. The next case defies us with fire. Number 3. Greek fire. The Byzantines had a weapon. They guarded the formula like a state secret, which it was. Around the year 672, an engineer named Callinicos of Heliopolis presented the formula to the imperial court at Constantinople. And from that point onward, for nearly 800 years, Byzantine warships could spray a burning liquid onto enemy fleets that water could not extinguish, that clung to wooden hulls, that reportedly burned on the surface of the sea itself. Arab fleets that had been advancing on Constantinople were turned back by it. Russian fleets were destroyed by it. Crusader chroniclers wrote about it with a mixture of horror and awe. The recipe was held by a single family of imperial engineers and a handful of trusted court officials. The components were prepared in secret. Even the delivery system, bronze siphons mounted on the prows of ships, pressurized by pumps and ignited at the nozzle, was treated as classified military technology. And then in 1453, when Constantinople fell, the formula vanished. Not gradually, not through neglect. Vanished. The chroniclers who survived the siege did not write it down. The engineers either died or kept their oath. By the time scholars in the 17th century began reconstructing what Greek fire might have been, the trail had gone cold by 200 years. We have theories. Crude petroleum from naturally occurring seeps near the Black Sea, mixed with quicklime, perhaps with sulfur, perhaps with resin or naphtha. The candidates are listed in every history of medieval warfare. Modern attempts to reconstruct it have produced incendiaries that work, sort of, in the right conditions sometimes. None of them does what the chronicles say Greek fire did. None of them burns on the surface of seawater, the way Anna Komnene described. None of them fits all the eyewitness accounts at once. What we know is that the formula was lost. What we suspect is that the loss was deliberate. From a fire we cannot reignite, we drop to a material that has been quietly outlasting us for 2,000 years. Number 4. Self-healing concrete. Roman in origin, in continuous medieval use across the parts of Italy and the Mediterranean, where the Roman recipe never fully died and only properly understood by modern science in 2023. Here is the puzzle that bothered engineers for generations. The Pantheon, completed in roughly 126 of the Common Era, is still standing. Its dome is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. Roman aqueducts, harbors, breakwaters that have been pounded by salt water for 2,000 years are still functionally intact. Modern concrete, by comparison, has a service life of around 50 to 100 years before it begins to crumble. We pour millions of tons of it every year. It does not last. For decades, scholars looked at the white chunks scattered throughout Roman and medieval Roman-style mortars, the so-called lime clasts, and dismissed them as evidence of sloppy mixing. Poor quality control, the textbook said. Lazy workmanship. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. The Pantheon's dome was big news once, and the story is still traveling. The textbooks were wrong about the lime clasts. In January 2023, a team led by Admir Masic at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working with colleagues at Harvard and laboratories in Italy and Switzerland, published the answer in Science Advances. The lime clasts were not mistakes. They were a feature. The Romans and the medieval builders who inherited the recipe in places like Ravenna and parts of southern Italy were using a technique called hot mixing, adding quicklime in its raw and reactive state directly into the dry mix before water was introduced. The reaction released heat, trapped reactive calcium inside small porous nodules throughout the matrix, and produced concrete with a self-healing mechanism built into its structure. When a micro crack forms, water seeps in, reaches one of the lime clasts, dissolves it, and the calcium-saturated solution flows into the crack and recrystallizes as fresh calcium carbonate. the material seals itself. The MIT team reproduced the effect in the lab. Cracks in their hot mix samples healed completely within 2 weeks of water exposure. Modern concrete, made with the slaked lime that replaced the Roman method centuries ago, simply cracks and stays cracked. We have only just begun to engineer concrete that approaches what they did by inheritance, and we are not there yet. From a building material we are still trying to catch up with, we cross to a medicine. Number 5. Bald's eyesalve. There is an Old English manuscript in the British Library called Bald's Leech Book. It dates to the 9th century. Among hundreds of recipes for what we would call early medieval medicine, the sorts of things academic historians used to dismiss as superstition mixed with folk practice. There is a remedy for a stye, an infection of the eyelid. The instructions are precise. Take garlic and another allium, probably onion or leek. Crush them together. Add wine, add bovine bile. Mix in a brass vessel. Let stand for 9 days. Strain, apply. For roughly 1,000 years, this was the kind of recipe that classically trained physicians would have politely set aside. In 2015, an interdisciplinary team at the University of Nottingham, led by the medievalist Christina Lee, working with microbiologists, decided to actually make it. They followed the manuscript exactly. Real garlic, real onion, real wine of the sort the recipe described, real ox bile from a butcher, 9 days, brass vessel, strain. Then they tested it on methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, the hospital superbug that has killed hundreds of thousands of people in the modern era because our antibiotics no longer reliably touch it. The medieval eyesalve killed it, not partially. In the laboratory cultures, it produced reductions in viable MRSA cell counts that competitive modern antibiotics struggle to match. A follow-up study at the University of Warwick in 2020, published in Scientific Reports, confirmed and extended the result against multiple drug-resistant biofilms. The full recipe worked. Garlic alone did not. Onion alone did not. The combination, fermented for exactly the time the manuscript specified, in exactly the vessel it specified, produced a synergistic effect that no single ingredient could explain. A 9th century Anglo-Saxon manuscript contains a working antibiotic against one of the most feared superbugs of the 21st century. We did not know that until 11 years ago. What else is sitting in those manuscripts that we have not yet bothered to reconstruct? From a recipe that survives, we cross to a machine that should not exist. Number 6. The Automata of Al-Jazari. In the year 1206, in what is now eastern Turkey, an engineer named Ismail ibn al-Razaz al-Jazari completed a manuscript called The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. It contained detailed engineering drawings, exploded views, exact dimensions, material specifications, for over 50 machines that he had personally designed and built for the Artukid court. Some of these machines were practical, water-raising pumps, irrigation systems, clocks. Others were not. Al-Jazari built programmable musical automata, robotic drummers and musicians arranged on a boat, performing different rhythms that could be reprogrammed by changing the position of pegs on a rotating drum. He built a hand-washing device for the Sultan in which a robotic servant offered a basin, then a towel in correct sequence. He built a peacock fountain that automatically dispensed soap and water in a programmed cycle. Look at the drawings. Modern historians of engineering, including the American mechanical engineer Donald Hill, who translated the manuscript in 1974, have noted that Al-Jazari was not just building toys. He was using camshafts, segmental gears, crankshafts, escapement mechanisms, and closed-loop feedback systems centuries before they appeared in European engineering. His programmable drum, with its rearrangeable pegs, is now widely cited as the first known programmable machine in history. The principle is the same one that, 800 years later, would be used to encode instructions in early computers. A medieval Islamic engineer working at the Artukid court in 1206 built a programmable robot. Reread that sentence. The textbook account is that programmable machines are a modern invention. The artifact is real. The book survives. The drawings are detailed enough that modern engineers have rebuilt several of his devices and confirmed that they work exactly as described. We did not invent automation in the 18th or 19th century. We rediscovered it. And after 800 years of rediscovery, we are not even at the strangest case in this video. The seventh entry is a measuring instrument that fits in your hand and is more accurate than the textbooks said it should be. Number 7. The medieval astrolabe. An astrolabe is a flat brass disc about the size of a dinner plate, engraved with concentric circles and rotating dials that allow its user to perform computations involving the positions of the sun, the stars, the time of day, the time of year, the latitude of the observer, and the direction of any celestial body above the horizon. The instrument is medieval Islamic in its developed form, refined in workshops in Baghdad, Damascus, Toledo, and Moraga between roughly the 8th and the 14th centuries. By 1300, an experienced astronomer with a good astrolabe could fix his position, determine the local time to within a few minutes, find the direction of Mecca, and predict the apparent positions of major stars for any night of the year. Here is the part that gets understated in textbooks. Surviving astrolabes from the great workshops, the Andalusian instruments by Ibrahim ibn Said, the Persian instruments from Moraga, the Mamluk instruments now scattered between the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford and the Smithsonian have been measured by modern metrologists. The angular errors on the best surviving examples are, in many cases, less than 1 degree of arc. Some are accurate to within fractions of a degree, engraved by hand with chisels and dividers, on brass plates, by craftsmen working without magnification, without precision machine tools, without modern alloys. A modern toolmaker, asked to reproduce the engraving accuracy of a 14th century Moraga astrolabe by hand, would consider the request unreasonable. The medieval makers did it routinely, and they did it for instruments that ordinary scholars and navigators carried in leather pouches as standard equipment. The textbook explanation is that medieval Islamic mathematics, geometry, and observational astronomy were highly advanced, which is true. The harder question is the one nobody asks. How did the craftsmen achieve those tolerances? The answer is that we are not entirely sure. The workshop traditions were oral. The masters trained the apprentices by showing, not by writing. When the workshops closed, the methods went with them. You can hold one of these instruments today, in a museum case in Oxford or Cambridge or Istanbul. Look at the engraving. Then ask yourself how a hand and a chisel produced a circle divided into degrees that a modern laser-cut instrument would barely improve on. 7 cases, 7 medieval technologies that modern science either cannot replicate, has only recently understood, or has had to reverse engineer from physical artifacts because the original method was deliberately or accidentally lost. What ties them together is not magic. It is something more uncomfortable. Each of these technologies was the product of a long, patient, hands-on tradition. Masters training apprentices for generations, recipes guarded by specific families or workshops, knowledge passed orally because writing it down was either dangerous or unnecessary when the chain of transmission was unbroken. And then the chain broke. A city fell. A workshop closed. A formula died with its keeper. The artifact survived, sitting in a museum or a cathedral or a manuscript archive, while the method that produced it slipped out of human knowledge. We are very good in the modern world at writing things down. We are not always so good at maintaining the kind of living, unbroken, master-to-apprentice tradition that produced the blue of Chartres or the pattern of a Wootz blade or the precise tolerances on a Moraga astrolabe. The medieval world ran on those traditions. When it ended, some of what it knew ended with it. Of the 7 cases we walk through, which one unsettles you most? The blue we cannot quite match, the steel with nanostructures inside it, the fire that burned on water,